Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode on the show. What if your podcast could become more than a platform for your voice? What if it could become a powerful, profitable media businesses? Today's guest is Bev Hampson, founder and CEO of Category Theory Media, and a media growth strategist who helps health experts, authors, and purpose-driven entrepreneurs turn their influence into sustainable revenue. With more than a decade of experience in podcasting, media strategy, sponsorships, affiliate marketing, and strategic partnerships, Bev has helped leading names in health and wellness create major revenue opportunities through aligned partnerships and audience-first growth. Today, we're talking about why downloads and vanity metrics aren't the whole story, and how to build partnership without compromising trust, and what it really takes to turn a podcast into a sustainable business. Bev, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so you have helped creators move beyond chasing downloads and vanity metrics. Why do so many podcasters get stuck measuring success that way? And what should they be looking at instead?
What should brands be looking at instead of metrics with content creators?
Yes, as well as podcasters.
So a lot of times podcasters are looking at, their full download metric. I have, 100 million downloads. I have 100,000 downloads, that type of thing. But really, we want to look at specific downloads. We want to look at how many downloads or listens your newest episode has in the first 30 days. That's realistically a metric that we're looking at, especially when it comes to brands and sponsorships, so that we have a better understanding of actually how many downloads or how many listeners your podcast has. When we look at the full number of how many downloads you've ever had, obviously it's a really big, lovely number, but it doesn't actually give an idea of who your audience is or how many of your audience is staying. And the same with monthly downloads, right? Sometimes we just look at the full monthly downloads. But if you as a podcaster have, 4, 5, 6 episodes in a month, and you're only looking at your monthly downloads, it doesn't give a full picture of how many listeners that you have listening to each individual episode.
Okay, thank you so much, Bev. So what does it actually take to turn a podcast from a content platform into a profitable media business?
Having a really engaged audience is very important. And that's what we look at when it comes to moving from just content creation into monetization and actually making money with brands. So you want to make sure that you know who your audience is, and you want to make sure that your audience is actually buying products or taking the advice that you're giving them. So how we do that in podcasting or in sponsorships with content creators is we want to start by, seeding either with like affiliate relationships. So for example, on this podcast, right, you would want to have an ad, or you want to talk about a brand, or talk about, a website or something that is very, useful for your audience. And you want to drive your audience to that either call to action, that URL, that website. And you want to be able to track that. So that's always the first step, is how engaged is your audience, and in whether you can direct them to go in a certain direction. That metric, being able to tell how engaged your audience is going to determine whether you can work with a brand or not, and then determining what types of brands that you want to work with. So for example, if you're a business podcast, you're probably not going to talk about red light or peptides on your podcast, because that's not what your audience is used to hearing about. So you want to engage with brands or products that are actually going to be useful for your audience. So those are the first steps that we always tell our podcasters. Hey, start with, how do you direct your audience? Are they leaving reviews? Are they going places that you're telling them to go to? And are you able to track that engagement with your audience?
Okay, thank you so much, Bev. So, moving on. My next question for you is, for podcasters who might be finding difficult to convert their audience into probably clients, those who want to monetize their audience without compromising the trust they have worked so hard to build. How can they do that?
How can you monetize an audience that isn't going in the direction that you're pointing them in? That can be very hard. Essentially, at that point, right, you want to look at either looking at YouTube ads, which are dynamically inserted ads from your YouTube channel. Again, if you don't have the trust of your audience to be able to move them into the different channels or to move them to products that are going to help them, right, which is also a trust factor, right? So even though your audience trusts you as the podcast creator to give them the best advice, with whatever area that is, they're also going to trust that the brands or the products that you're bringing them are going to be good as well. If you're concerned about losing that trust because you're talking about a brand, then you want to talk about less brands. More is not better when it comes to talking about brands or products on your podcast. You want to stay really succinct. So, for example, we work with podcasters and they only talk about 3 brands or 3 products. That's it. That's all they talk about because they are so, they're very wary of losing the trust of their audience. So they want to make sure that they're being really succinct. If you do have a lot of trust with your audience, you should be able to break through the sponsorship. You shouldn't have a problem. If you already don't have trust with your audience, they like your content, but they don't care about your endorsement, therefore you don't have a lot of trust there, then it doesn't matter if you talk about brands or not. You already don't have a trust factor.
Okay, so what makes a brand partnership genuinely valuable and aligned rather than just another sponsorship deal?
Having a really, as a podcast creator, having a really great relationship with your brands is really important. So what we tell podcasters is, or content creators, right? Even if you're an Instagram content creator, something along that line, YouTube, starting relationships with brands and products early on is really important. Even if you do it just on an affiliate basis. So an affiliate is a revenue share, right? So you're not actually taking money up front to talk about a brand or a product on your podcast or your channel. You have a call to action, somebody buys using your code, and you get to share the revenue with the brand, right? That creates a really great trust with the brand. It also creates really great trust with your audience. And so if you do that, even though your podcast isn't large enough to monetize, you could do it on an affiliate basis, a revenue share. Once your podcast does get large enough to move to a sponsorship or taking money up front for advertising, you've already created a sustainable relationship with a brand that you've been doing revenue share with. Those brands are going to be your low-hanging fruit to convert them into sponsorships because they already know your audience. They already know your metrics. They already know how well your audience will buy on an affiliate, and they won't have a problem moving to a sponsorship deal with you. So that creates this really beautiful partnership with a brand as opposed to transactional only. Other things that you can do with those brands is thinking outside the box. So as opposed to just saying, hey, you're going to give me money, I'm going to talk about this product, and I'm never going to talk to you again as a brand, right? So those are things that you can think outside the box. So I'm going to do a webinar with this brand, or I'm going to do a giveaway on my Instagram, or I'm going to have the founder on my podcast to talk about the education and the science surrounding the product that they do. Those are all things that are outside the box ideas that you can do with a brand that's actually going to create a solid relationship and further alignment so that you will continue to work with them for years and years.
Okay, so you live by the philosophy, if it is not a hell yes, is a hell no. How do you know when an opportunity that looks great on paper is actually the wrong opportunity?
I mean, there could be a lot of different factors for a hell yes and a hell no. When it comes to a brand deal with a podcaster, the values of the company have to align with the podcaster. How they make the product, where does it come from, who the partnership manager is, who your contact has been, over time with that brand? Have they worked with you in other capacities? Did you do an affiliate relationship with that brand before you did a sponsorship deal with them? There are so many different factors to determine whether it's a hell yes or a hell no. A big one is when a podcaster comes to me and says, hey, I just got this really lucrative deal from this brand, but I don't know if I totally love the product. It uses an ingredient that I don't totally love. Maybe it uses a sweetener, right? I really don't like the taste of stevia versus sucralose, or I don't like any alternative sweeteners. If you have to convince yourself to work with a brand, it is a hell no, 100% of the time. If you have to convince them that this is a good idea, if you have to convince yourself, your conscience, to decide that I'm going to do this because the money's good, money can come from anywhere. If one brand is willing to pay you to do some sort of sponsorship, you know that there's going to be 10 more brands that are going to be willing to do the same thing. So it's not the money, right? It's really how you can live with it if you do that deal. And it's not the end of the world. Even if you do a deal that was probably a hell no, but you just did the deal anyways, doesn't mean that you can't come back from that. Doesn't mean that you can change your mind later. You can always change your mind.
Thank you so much, Bev. That was a wonderful answer. So, you have worked with major names in health and wellness. Tell us what separates creators who successfully build revenue from those who struggle to monetize their influence. A lot of people have influence, but they are broke.
That's a really good question. Some of the best podcasters that have monetized their content aren't massive. They just have a really engaged audience. So that audience that I was talking about, that you can, move them to a website, or you can ask them to leave a review. Those audiences, we call them highly engaged audiences, and we can actually track the percentage of engaged audiences that we have. And so those podcasters, that you could have 5,000 downloads per episode in the first 30 days, which is a little bit of a lower number when you're talking about monetization. Those audiences, so say you have 5,000 downloads per episode in the first 30 days, if you have an 85% engagement rate, that's a very highly engaged audience. That audience is moving with you. They go to the website, they leave the review, they leave comments for you, that kind of thing. Those audiences are exactly what brands are looking for. Brands are not looking for 1 million downloads a month with a 40% engagement rate. 40% is incredibly low. It means that your audience is really not doing what you tell them to do, and they're not engaged with the host. There's no trust. So brands are not looking for those. Brands are looking for an audience that's going to convert based on trust. And so I would say that would be the biggest downfall, even for podcasters that have huge audiences. One, they're looking at the wrong metrics. So, hey, I have 200 million downloads. That's amazing. Buy my advertising. But brands are saying, no. We need to see the downloads per episode in the first 30 days, and we need to see the engagement. And we need to see if you've ever done advertising before or revenue share relationships, right? We can track all of those metrics to see if moving to a sponsorship is a good idea. Sometimes it's not. But those smaller podcasters that have highly engaged audiences, they're the ones that are monetizing incredibly well.
Okay, so what are the biggest mistakes podcasters make when pursuing sponsorship and strategic partnerships?
Not having a media deck. So we highly recommend that podcasters have a media deck. A media deck could be 1 to 2 page PDF that showcases who you are as a podcaster and a content creator and provides your metrics. That's very important. A brand cannot move forward with a deal based on assumption. They need to have hard facts. So in the media deck, we are looking for the downloads per episode in the first 30 days. I've talked about that. We're looking for your monthly downloads as well. Monthly downloads, they are helpful when we look at a large podcast. So for example, you're a podcaster and you have 400 episodes. You've been around a while. You have 400 episodes. And let's say you're doing 50,000 downloads per month of all of your episodes on the podcast. So that number, obviously 50,000 downloads per episode, is different than your downloads per episode in the first 30 days. So let's say your downloads per episode in the first 30 days is only 5,000 and you have 4 episodes in a month, right? We're at 20,000 downloads. So that tells us that the other 30,000 downloads, right? Because you have 50,000 downloads in a month, 20,000 are coming from new episodes. Where's the other 30,000 coming from? Oh, those are all of your older episodes, right? All of that 400 episodes that you have, all of the 30,000 downloads are coming from those older episodes. So I want to see that in a media deck. I want to see your monthly downloads, and I also want to see your per episode in the first 30-day downloads. I also want to see your engagement score. A lot of people don't know their engagement score, but you can find your engagement score. So I'd like to see that. I'd like to see what other brands you've worked with to see if I'm a good fit. For example, if you're a podcaster and you have worked with software companies before, they've bought advertising from you, but now we have a supplement company that wants to work with you. It's not really apples to apples. When you've endorsed supplement companies and that's gone really well, and you've never endorsed a software, or vice versa, you've endorsed software, but you've never done supplement, right? We don't necessarily know that your audience is going to work. So I want to see what other brands you've worked with. I also want to see your social media channels. How many Instagram followers do you have? Do you have a TikTok? Do you have a YouTube channel? How big is a YouTube channel? Do you have an email list? I want to see all that information in your media deck. One of the worst things you can do as a podcaster is not provide that information, because brands are inundated with podcast creators and content creators right now. So if you provide a media deck, it doesn't have all the information you need. The brands aren't necessarily going to ask you for that information. They're going to move on to somebody else. So provide as much information as you can so that they can stay engaged with you as a brand.
Okay, so if someone has a small but highly engaged podcast audience, what would you recommend they do today to start turning their influence into revenue?
I would start, if you've never done any advertising before, you've never worked with a brand before, I would start with either some affiliates, so revenue sharing. So think of a few brands or products in your home or that align with your podcast. And I would put some ads in your podcast for that brand or for that software, right? Reach out to the brand, get an affiliate code. So that's a revenue sharing code. Just as you've heard on podcasts before, a 45-second ad, use my code, get 10% off, blah, 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 right? So add something like that into your podcast if you've never done that before. And then track it over the next 30 or 60 days. Track how much use your code has. Has there been sales? What percentage of commission are you getting, right? So that's a really great thing to do. Other things you can do if you don't want to have an ad in your podcast, ask your audience to leave a review. Ask them to follow you. Ask them to go to your website to get a free download. Again, that's going to tell you how much engagement your audience has. So if you put that in your podcast and all of a sudden you get 400 reviews on Apple, that's really good. That means your audience is really engaged. They're doing what you've asked them to do. That's amazing. So I would start there right away, and that's going to provide some metrics that are going to help you get to monetization.
Okay, thank you so much, Bev. So finally, if you could give every podcaster listening one piece of advice about building a sustainable media business, what would it be?
Stay true to your values as a podcaster and stay true to your passion as a podcaster. So if you have a podcast about, I don't know, about merchant fees, that sort of thing, then that's what your podcast is about. And if you're passionate about that topic, you should continue, because that's what your audience sees. That's what they hear, is how passionate you are about something. If you decide one day hey, I don't want to talk about business anymore, and now I'm going to talk about football, but I don't really care about football. That just seems to be what everyone's talking about. Your audience is going to know that. They're going to hear it. They're going to hear it in your voice. They're going to hear it in your episode that that's not something that you really like to talk about. So be passionate about what you're passionate about, because your audience, they're engaged, they're here for it. Stay within that space if that's what you're passionate about, because niche spaces are great. When we have generic podcasting, so for example, I'm a health and wellness podcast and I talk about just generic things for health and wellness, those don't do as well as if I'm a health and wellness podcast and I specifically talk about peptides, right? Like that's what your audience really wants. They want something very specific. You might be able to branch off from that specific topic, but ultimately you always come back to that topic because that's what you're passionate about and that's what your audience is looking for. So stay consistent and stay true to your passion and keep going.
All right. Thank you so much, Bev. This has been a very great conversation. I love the idea that building a successful podcast isn't simply about getting more listeners. It's about building something valuable around the trust and relationships you create with those listeners. So for those who are listening right now who would like to connect with you and learn more about what you do, how
Absolutely.
can they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find us on Instagram at Category 3 Media. You can find us on LinkedIn at Category 3 Media. And our website is category3.ca, category3.ca, where you can learn more about how we work with podcasters on advertising, monetization. We also work on book launches in the health and wellness space, and we're always happy to have a conversation about growth strategy when it comes to podcasting. That's very important.
All right. Thank you so much. And to my audience, if this episode is speaking to you, make sure you share it with someone out there who should hear this. As always, I love you guys so much, and I will see you guys on the next episode. Thank you so much, Bev. It's a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks for having me. Have a great night. Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.